Everyone. My name is Nicolas Haché. I am the acting manager for National Contact Point Coordination. And on behalf of the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, I am pleased to welcome you to this event marking the 20th anniversary of national contact points as non-judicial grievance mechanisms. On this occasion, the RBC Center is launching a report which you can download on a website. So you should see the link somewhere above my head, and we will also copy it in the chat. This report is not a policy document by governments, it's a piece of research and vision by the OECD Secretariat. And it has three goals. First, inform a wide audience about the role of NCPs in providing remedy. Second, analyze how NCPs have contributed to remedy over the last 20 years. And third, identify possible areas of action by governments to strengthen the mechanism. So to dive deeper into these issues, we have a great program today with a keynote, 2 panels, and a guest intervention. So let's start immediately. And with that, I am pleased to pass the floor to Professor Christine Kaufmann, Chair of the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct, for a keynote address. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, I'm very pleased to speak to you today as we do have reason to celebrate. This year, as Nicola outlined, marks 20 years since national contact points became the first and still only non-judicial grievance mechanism built into a leading responsible business conduct standard, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. As the chair of the Working Party, I'm often asked what NCPs are. Contact points for what? And who contacts them? National contact points have the mandate to contribute to the resolution of issues related to the implementation of the OECD guidelines by companies in cases called specific instances. So a lot of technical language. NCPs also are responsible for promoting the guidelines. So what does that technical mandate language really mean? It essentially means that national contact points are responsible business authorities. Over the past 2 decades, NCPs have applied a range of approaches to support agreement between parties, from informal dialogue to professional mediation. Many NCPs have also gone beyond pure support, and they have played a more active role in making recommendations to the parties on how to implement the guidelines. You may say, well, it's mediation, it's dialogue, it's recommendation. It sounds rather soft. That's true. But in fact, there is a hard binding element to it. All governments adhering to the guidelines are required, legally required, to set up a national contact point and provide it with sufficient financial and human resources so that it can function effectively. And effectively means in a visible, accessible, transparent, and accountable way. Today, there are NCPs in 49 countries. So we have 16 more than when we started 20 years ago. And these NCPs have collectively handled over 500 cases in more than 100 jurisdictions and territories so far. The world has changed tremendously since NCPs were first introduced. And of course, so have business-related impacts, in essence, the substance that NCPs are dealing with. It is therefore timely to take a close look of NCPs practice today. Can national contact points accommodate these new developments? We have seen new, more complex pattern of production and consumption that are emerging, capital goods and services that are more mobile than ever. And it goes without saying that this growth in globalized business activity, together with technological developments such as digitalization, has helped facilitate a better quality of life overall. Yet, let's be open and honest, globalization is also partly responsible for some of the most severe global problems. I'm thinking of dramatic increases in greenhouse gas emissions, massive biodiversity loss, inequality increasing in many countries, and globalization has also left many people with an increasing sense of disenfranchisement. Most recently, we have all become aware of the role globalization plays in both the spread of COVID-19, but also in the fight against the virus. Globalization also goes hand in hand with the growing complexity of global supply chains, corporate structures, and subcontracting practices, which together create challenges in assessing the responsibility and in identifying companies' leverage to address these impacts. Against this backdrop, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises have become more relevant than ever, and so has the need to improve responsible business conduct standards worldwide. To make these standards effective on the ground for people's real lives, NCPs have a very important role to play. It's NCPs that provide access to remedy and ensure business accountability in the context of RBC. Yes, I said it at the outset, and Nicola mentioned it too. This is a day for celebrating. And indeed, there is much to be proud of. Over the past 20 years, across many cases, NCPs have provided affordable, accessible, and flexible forums to address an incredibly diverse range of RBC issues. They dealt with human rights, they dealt with the environment, labor issues. Some started dealing with taxation. Successful outcomes had an impact on affected people's real lives. And to mark this anniversary, the OECD, as was mentioned, the Secretariat is launching the new report, National Contact Points for RBC, providing access to remedy today. And this report is very important for two reasons, at least, I would say. First, by reflecting on NCP activity over the past 20 years, it highlights both the strengths but also the challenges of this unique grievance mechanism. For example, the report shows how many NCPs, thanks to their broad mandate, their availability, affordability, and flexibility, contributed substantially to resolving issues raised. It shows how they promoted RBC policy coherence across government and globally. However, and let me be very clear here, this is not the time to lay back. As the report rightly cautions, such achievements should not hide a number of challenges NCPs have encountered. We've seen parties that are unwilling to participate in good offices. We also see expectations for remedy that are outside the possibility of a non-judicial grievance mechanism. And there is also what I would call homemade challenges within NCPs and within the NCP system itself. Its NCP structure, their visibility and exposure, their accessibility and timeliness, and their ability to ensure equitable and safe proceedings. The report also addresses these challenges. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, celebrating and looking at achievements and challenges is, of course, important, but it is not enough. If we want the NCP system to be fit for the next decade, to remain credible, to enjoy the trust of stakeholders, we need to take action. And we need to take action now. 49 governments committed to establishing an effective functioning NCP. Still, if we take a closer look, NCPs are at very different levels and procedures vary greatly. Governments committed to functional equivalence of NCPs, they did so for a reason. And the reason is very simple. It's to provide equal access to an effective remedy across the whole NCP system. It's as simple as that. And it should not make a difference for complainants which NCP they seize. However, today we are not there yet, and we need to do more to live up to this promise. In this regard, the report achieves a second and very important purpose. It pinpoints two broad areas of action that governments could take to maximize their NCP's contribution to remedy. One focuses on individual NCPs, the other on the collective action of the network. Some of these action areas may be adopted in the short term with minimal formalities, so an easy win, while others may require a more long-term and more systemic agenda. What actions could be done quickly? First, governments can and should invest more in NCPs. Lots, if not all NCPs, need more resources in terms of staff, training, and finances to fully fulfill their mandate in a changing world. And don't tell me the pandemic is getting in the way. It's the other way around. The pandemic does not change, but underscores this finding. Second, NCPs are all different, which is great to ensure that they fit the national context best. However, governments should review the existing institutional arrangements for their respective NCPs and make sure they appropriately engage stakeholders and have their trust. What requires a more systemic vision? The report here makes the point that NCPs can do more collectively to function as a system of remedies. It is imperative that governments ensure that their NCPs have clear rules of procedure in place, and that these rules are coordinated across all NCPs when it comes to central aspects of the specific instance process. And such pressing issues where action is needed include initial assessment thresholds, where we see very different levels, the fear of reprisals, and claims of conflict of interests, as well as measures to enforce timelines, verify case outcomes for compliance with the guidelines, and last but not least, enhance the follow-up process. In the OECD, in the Working Party, in the NCP network, we talk a lot about strengthening the NCP system. It's a recurring theme for countries adhering to the guidelines. In taking this commitment seriously, this report can in fact be the occasion to go further and consider whether the way NCPs are told to operate in the guidelines, and particularly the procedural guidance, is still fit for purpose. Do these criteria allow us to monitor the performance of the network in the next decade effectively? This question comes at a very timely moment, not only to celebrate the past 20 years, but also to ensure that the system is fit for purpose for the next decade. It connects very well with the stock-taking exercise that the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct will engage in next year on the occasion of the 10 years of the last revision of the guidelines in 2011. In closing, throughout the last 20 years, many stories illustrate the NCP's contribution to remedy. Yet the world in which NCPs operate and in which they were first designed has changed. And with that have come greater complexities, both within the cases that NCPs handle and the institutions themselves. To keep pace with today's challenges and to respond to the increased calls for responsible business conduct, it is critical that NCPs continue to hone their strength, but also that their operational and structural weaknesses are addressed. Only then will NCPs be true responsible business authorities. Addressing these weaknesses requires action at the level of governments, as much as in respect of their individual NCPs, as in respect of the NCP network as a whole. The report launched today is a first step in that direction. And I do hope that 10 years from now, when we will gather again, We will look at 2020 not only as the year of the pandemic, but as the year when we got serious about reviewing and enhancing individual NCPs, serious in ensuring an NCP system that lives up to its promise and enjoys the trust of all stakeholders. With this, I would like to thank you, and I would like to congratulate and thank the Secretariat for launching the discussion with this excellent report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Christine, for your appreciation of the work of NCPs and for highlighting their strengths, but also the challenges they face, and also for sharing with us your vision of the future and what it will take to get there. Let us now go to the first panel on our program, which is entitled Perspectives on NCPs and Remedy, which will be moderated by Christina Tebarles, Acting Head of the OECD RBC Center. So may I ask all panelists on the first panel to turn on their videos now? So Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicolas, and thank you, Christine, for your very inspiring opening remarks. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first panel discussions, which will share perspectives on the contribution of NCPs to remedy over the past 20 years. The discussions today will build on the report's findings, which unpacks the contributions that NCPs have made to remedy over the past 20 years. And will, as well as looks at the factors that have presented challenges to NCP's remedy road. The report makes a number of key findings relating to NCP's contributions. For example, the report notes that NCPs have handled a broad range of issues arising in almost every corner of the globe. As Christine already mentioned, they have looked at questions related to child labor, forced labor, unlawful exploitation of natural resources, climate change impacts, migration detention centers, anti-union dismissals, greenwashing, bribery, false advertising, corporate tax avoidance, to name just a few. NCPs have been available and affordable to all types of submitters, from trade unions and NGOs to members of parliament and indigenous communities, as well as individuals and even companies and business associations themselves. NCPs have a lot of flexibility to facilitate discussion between parties through tools such as mediation, recommendations, and determinations, and many have gone out of their way to bring parties together to get to an agreement. And let's not forget that NCPs, as experts for responsible business conduct, as Christine already mentioned, have also promoted RBC policy coherence within their own governments, and they have contributed to integrating RBC across policies and practices, for example, in public procurement. Yet, as was already mentioned, there are also challenges that NCPs have encountered over the past 20 years, and the report makes a point of reflecting on these. These challenges include visibility and exposure, timeliness, accessibility, and safe and fair proceedings. In this panel, we will invite the speakers to reflect on the past 20 years' experience of working in an NCP or using the NCP system. We will ask them to highlight what has worked well and to unpack the many challenges that remain. I will start with Frode Elgesem, the chair of Norway's NCP. Frode, drawing from the practice of the Norwegian NCP and your experience as its chair, can you comment on the role of NCPs in fostering remedy for RBC impacts? And could you tell us what makes NCPs unique in this regard from the point of view of their mandate, their methodology, the outcomes they seek? And if you could highlight some challenges that the Norwegian NCP has encountered in facilitating remedy, for example, by providing your views on some of the cases that you have handled recently. Frode, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this important seminar and to the celebration of the NCP system. There are big questions in the short time, but I'll comment on a few of those points that you mentioned, Christine. And I think the main experience is that through these 20 years of case law, the NCPs has shown ability to facilitate remedy. And there are some salient points or salient aspects of the NCP system, which I think should be highlighted. And one of them is that it is an open complaint mechanism. You don't have to demonstrate this narrow legal interest, as long as you have a more open, legitimate interest. You may lodge a complaint. So we see complaints from NGOs, unions, victims, of course, local authorities, local communities, and so forth. So it's a low threshold and open mechanism, and it's accessible. And you don't see many jurisdictional issues, as you often see in court cases, as long as the company is working in or out of the NCP country. And maybe most importantly, you don't see commercial law issues restraining the NCP's possibility to look or address issues in the supply chains. So, and that is of course because the OECD guidelines extends the responsibilities of companies also to seek to prevent and mitigate issues and impacts in the supply chains. So in a case before an NCP, you can raise issues concerning working conditions, human rights issues, environmental issues, deep down in the supply chain, and engage the company in discussions over that, which is a very important feature of the NCP mechanism and the OECD guidelines, of course. So it's an open and accessible and flexible system, which makes it actually very well suited for providing or facilitating remedy, and it's been doing so, as I said, and maybe fair to say, increasingly so over the last years. We have been facilitating remedy. We see from the case law that NCP cases and NCP procedures are maybe more forward-looking than a court case would be, which would more look at the history of the case. Of course, a NCP procedure, an NCP complaint mechanism will also have what happened back in the issues, actual issues, what happened will be the basis for the recommendations that they make. But nevertheless, it is capable of or both addressing the issues that is the basis of the complaint, but also seeking to remedy situations within the company with a view to secure rights and interests in a better way going forward, which is an important part of that mechanism. So, in one case which illustrates that very well, I think, is a Norwegian case, or a case before the Norwegian NCP from 2013 against Norwegian Pension Fund. In the case, the Norwegian NCP was able to confirm or to demonstrate that the fund was responsible also as a minority shareholder in the company. So the OECD guidelines also applied to the minority shareholder, which increased the attention within the fund on the situation in its investee companies. So it created change within the fund, but it also sparked off a debate and a work within OECD, which resulted in a comprehensive guide for international investors, which had a general and important effect. And also, climate change has been at issue before for the Dutch NCP, and in a case against the international bank ING, ING accepted that they had an obligation to steer their lending portfolio towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement of keeping the development below 2 degrees. So, which also is a very important development and underscores the flexibility of the NCP system. And then again, in the Bralima case, the Dutch NCP was able to broker an agreement between Heineken and employees of its Congolese daughter company, and providing compensation for workers that were unreasonably laid off in a mass layoff in Congo. And also the Swiss NCP brought in FIFA to the table and addressed issues concerning the situation for migrant workers on the building sites for the 2022 Qatar World Cup, and then established new policies within FIFA, and also established separate complaint mechanisms, which could again offer remedy and compensation to workers that were victims of abuse. Also remedy can mean different things. So in the Norwegian case, concerning a conflict between a windmill or power plant consisting of windmill park, and reindeer herders, the NCP was not able to determine that there was a breach of the guidelines, but encouraged the parties to continue their discussions, which resulted in an agreement later on providing compensations to the reindeer herders, the Sami people affected by this windmill park. And we followed that up. In addition to that, we followed that with a seminar, and we then kept our attention, or we had a continued attention on the conflict, and followed that up for many years. And keeping the dialogue on active dialogue between the company and the actual Sami people. So which continue to discuss what is the best solution. So there's different ways of providing remedy, which also should be part of the understanding of how these NCPs works. There are challenges, of course, ahead. We have some challenges in the Norwegian NCP that not all companies agree to participate, which is a basic requirement. I think that will change over time, so we'll not see too many of those cases. And of course, it's more complex cases. It's hard to do the fact finding, and it's required resources. So strengthening of the NCP system will be welcome also for our NCP and throughout the NCP family, I think, as Catherine mentioned by the start of this session. So there's some challenges ahead, but I think it's a unique complaint mechanism that will be, I think, central in the work for more responsible business conduct in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frode. And thanks in particular also for highlighting some cases which have helped raise the awareness also of the financial sector on their role and responsibility in promoting RBC. And thank you also for mentioning not only cases from the Norwegian NCP, but also cases handled by other NCPs, and for mentioning the NCP family. And this is indeed a value added of the NCP system, that it's not just individual agencies working on their own. It's a true network where there's a lot of exchange of experience and also cooperation between NCPs. And I think that also contributes to successful outcomes. And another important thing you mentioned is that one of the features of NCPs is that they can keep the dialogue open. So they have a forward-looking approach. They don't just finish their job by when a case finishes, either with an agreement or without, but they are also able to continue the dialogue with the party. So I think that's a very important point, and thank you very much for highlighting it. So we'll now turn to Wieland Quadflick from Business at OECD, who is, I think, part of the NCP fan club. As a representative of business at the OECD, could you tell us how companies approach remedy for RBC impacts? And could you tell us why they should engage with NCPs in this regard? And again, here I would appreciate if you could build on your experience and tell us what the factors are that may encourage companies to participate in the NCP process, and also what may be chilling for them. And here I would like to mention that BIAC organized an event a few years ago with companies that had experience with the NCP network. So I would very much appreciate if you could also draw on those experiences. Thank you, Wieland. The floor is yours.
Yeah, Christina, thank you very much. And thank you for providing this opportunity to present our views. And I think the meeting has been excellently prepared also by the study that is released now. Business at OECD has since 2011 constantly supported and promoted the guidelines and the NCP instrument. And as Christine Kaufmann just said, we think that today these instruments are more relevant than ever. The NCP is a unique instrument, and it is the only of its kind. It has a unique philosophy, being state-based and non-judicial. It is providing good offices, and the essence is that it is assisting, not punishing, and that it is cooperation, not litigation. This character, this specific character, in our view, must be preserved, it must be cherished, it must be accentuated, and it must be further elaborated. And also because the report that is released today shows that it produces results. Now, why do companies engage in NCP procedures? There is a clear potential to provide added value. That was the main conclusion of this meeting that you referred to 3 years ago. The NCP system provides a constructive dialogue and a forward-looking approach, what Frode also just said. It provides a basis for longer-term stakeholder dialogue. It stimulates changes in internal business procedures and dialogues. And it is very open for the complainant, but it is also relatively fast and less expensive for business. What is also important for business is that there is a good initial assessment process to avoid frivolous cases so that you can concentrate on the cases that really matter. As far as the concerns of companies are there are sometimes worries among companies about the varying quality and the varying capacity of NCPs. Not all NCPs are really well equipped to do their job. There is always a risk for the reputation of the company, as sometimes in the media and also sometimes promoted by certain stakeholders, the engagement in the NCP procedure is presented in a way as a proof of guilt. Whereas we think that participating in an NCP procedure is in fact proving that a company wants to improve the situation. So in our view, it is a positive element when you participate and not a negative element. And then another concern of companies is that there is often a combination between of an NCP procedure and campaigning. And this combination can damage the trust that parties should have in the good faith of each other. In general, we as business at OECD, we have always encouraged companies to participate in procedures, and we intend to continue doing so. Now, concerning the future of the NCP system, I have 5 points, which all come to the same general point, and that is that more should be done to leverage the potential of NCPs. First point is that more commitment should be there from governments. Many NCPs are underfunded and under-equipped. 50% only have part-time dedicated staff, and 31 of 49 NCPs do not have a dedicated budget. That is, of course, not a basis for developing the system. And if governments expect from business to follow up the guidelines, then they should also do their own homework. And many challenges which are mentioned in the report that you mentioned are in fact related to this point. Then the second point is that we should respect and build upon the unique specificity of the NCPs. As I said, non-judicial, it is an instrument to provide good offices. There are constant attempts to blur, in fact, the lines between this good offices process and the more litigation-oriented process. And in our view, we should use the strength of this system instead of trying to make a combination with other systems. This also implies, of course, that should be a common understanding by all stakeholders on the nature of this process. and communicate on this. This is linked to my third point, communication. I think you also mentioned it. Being involved in an NCP process is not proof of wrongdoing. It is proof that a company wants to improve. So it should not be defamating, but in fact, it should improve the image of the company. My fourth point is on the number of cases. There are now 500 cases in 20 years. That is, of course, an important body of precedents, touching upon many fields, as you mentioned before, and Frode as well. But one would say that the system has much more potential. And this is, again, very much linked to my first point on the capacity. And it is also linked to what Christine Kaufmann just said about effective monitoring. There is more room for that. My fifth and last point is that we should strengthen the peer learning processes. It is important for business that while respecting the flexibility for governments to organize their own NCPs, there is also a gradual process of coordination and harmonization based on best practices. And then my final last point is there have been a number of cases in the recent past where complainants have been harassed or even have been threatened. And we think that that is an unacceptable situation. This process should function well, and that means also that complainants can be free and safe when they come up with concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wienand. This was a very rich presentation and also with many constructive suggestions. I think many of the things that you said boil down also to one point you made, which is good faith. The success of NCPs builds on the good faith with which parties engage and also communicate about this engagement. And as you said, I mean, engaging with an NCP should be seen as a positive sign, as a positive gesture by a company and not be understood as already a recognition of any kind of guilt. So again, good faith is extremely important and communication around that as well. Before I turn to my next speaker, I wanted to encourage the audience to send us questions through the chat so that we can engage in a discussion with the panelists. It will be a short discussion because we don't have a lot of time, but I would still like to be able to ask a few questions to the panelists. And with this, I will turn to Blake, who is replacing Liz Blackshaw, who was supposed to speak in this panel and which would have added a bit of more gender balance to the speaker. So normally we try to make sure that all our panels are gender balanced. In this case, there was a last minute change. So this was not intended, but I'm sure that Blake can give us an excellent view from the point of view of trade unions and tell us why trade unions engage with the NCP system. Tell us a bit about your experience and why trade unions choose to turn to an NCP, and maybe give us a few examples on what they have achieved in the process and what were the factors that led to positive outcomes and what were the challenges. Please try and do so in no more than 5 minutes so that we have time for a few questions and answers. Blake, please.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Chair Kaufmann and the whole RBC team for quite a fair report and also a moment of celebration for the 20 years. I think that this is definitely a time to do that and reflect in that context. So again, apologies for Liz not being able to join us, and also for the gender balance. That is something I was hoping we would have been able to accomplish, and she would have been a very good spokesperson. She's one of two, myself being the other one, two cases that have produced agreements on the issue of freedom of association. Chapter 5, the guidelines cover the ILO standards and conventions leading to unions being formed. So I will put aside my role at the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD at the moment, and I'll step back to my role prior to coming to TUAC in 2019. And 22 years ago, I came to the union movement after failing to lead a restaurant that I was working at to organize and become a part of the union. We didn't have an OECD knowledge at the time. Nobody really was aware of what the possibilities might have been for an OECD, and there certainly wasn't an awareness of what the national contact point would have been. I've since been working for the union. We've happened to be the union in the United States that have filed more, I think, more cases than probably any affiliated union over the course of the past 20 years. And I think it's important to just put it into context from our perspective. We have normally unions decide to participate in an NCP case or bring a case for one reason only, that they have, there is a global audience that they're not able to get in their own country. There's a global audience that is familiar with and experts on sustainability in ways that people that very few are, in fact, in the global policy development world. So in short, it's really the expertise. There's a strategic approach that the NCP offers, combining with voices of 48 others, so 49 total NCPs have the expertise and capacity to help workers when all else has failed. And I think that's important. This is when all else has failed in company relations, industrial relations that have failed to produce dialogue, that workers are seeking to find a friendly voice. And in fact, they do find a friendly voice. In many cases, we do find workers are very surprised when they start participating in an NCP case to find that somebody actually does really want to support their effort to have dialogue with this large multinational, that they want to support the issue of joining a union, forming a union, becoming part of the process of collective bargaining. And so that is something that is very positive and to be supported and celebrated. I estimate around 2.5 to 3 million workers in 20 years have benefited in some form of an agreement over the course of that 20 years. That's a remarkable accomplishment for the OECD. It's obviously not as large as unions and workers would like, but it's still a very big accomplishment that the NCPs should take credit for and be positive and proud of. Now, as far as the challenges, though, the challenges go at this point for trade unions outweigh the positives and the achievements. And the challenges are, I think, rooted on a couple of basic issues. The first being, as I said, dialogue where it wasn't otherwise possible. In many cases, if workers are bringing a case to an NCP, they're asking the NCP to do something that wasn't possible otherwise. So they're in a government, in an OECD government or some other government, that is not possible to ask for freedom of association in some cases. In the United States, I can tell you my experience is that. And so we're asking it's a very big ask of NCPs. And in fact, again, myself and Liz being the 2 out of 5 cases dealing with freedom of association in the past 10 years that have led to an agreement. So the dialogue is not the standard for business, and asking the NCP to do it is very difficult. So, going forward, I think that the opportunity lies in the strategic frameworks that the NCP offers, the working together with the other, all 49 working together. I think that that is something very important. And that their overall respect for their role as the center of regulatory and strategic approaches to sustainability, that needs to be something that we all spend time raising and raising to a level that gets the respect it deserves.
Thank you, Blake. And with this, I will take a few questions from the chat. We've received quite a lot. Actually, I would like to highlight that there are a number of questions from Africa. So it's very interesting to see that we have many people connected from Africa. They are asking if there's an NCP in their country, how they could do, what they could do to have one. So yeah, I find this is a very interesting development. But what I will do, since we only have a few minutes left, is I will ask one question per speaker. And at the same time, this is also your opportunity to make closing remarks, because we don't have enough time to do this in two sets. So one question and closing remarks at the same time. So I will start, since I have a question here for Vinand. So you mentioned this negative perception of companies participating with an NCP, that immediately they will be seen as guilty. What can we do about that? Because of course this tall poppy syndrome of someone being out there, being visible, also immediately fragilizes that company and makes it more open to scrutiny. What can be done about that? And at the same time, give us your final remarks.
Yeah, well, I think the essence is to show what the procedure really is and what it isn't. Sometimes in the communication and public statements, the NCP is presented as a kind of public prosecutor, which of course it is not. It is a promoter of dialogue, it is a provider of good offices. And I think if you present it in that way and make clear that it is not a kind of criminal investigation, then you get a totally different picture. And I think then that is also what can move things forward. I was struck by what Blake said, that 2.5 to 3 million workers, in fact, benefited from the NCP system and from NCP procedures. I think that is a very important number to show that the system works in the way it works now, and that we don't need to transform it into something else, but that we should make it function better the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinand. There's a question here regarding tech companies, the trend of high growth tech-driven companies. So maybe Frode, would you like to pick up that question? So what is, in your view, the role of NCPs with this sector, with the technology sector, I would say the sector of digitalization? We have worked a lot lately in the Working Party on RBC, on digitalization, RBC. What do you see the role of NCPs here and the key challenges that you're facing when dealing with cases related to the digital economy?
Well, the Norwegian NCP hasn't had any cases directly concerning that. One issue, I mean, as a starting point, the OECD guidelines applies to these companies as well, and can be very relevant in many aspects for the different big international digital companies delivering services on the internet. One problem, of course, is a general problem concerning these companies, that it may be hard to pin down where they actually belong. So in those cases, it could be some jurisdictional issues. But as long as they operate in or have effects in an OECD country, there may be possibilities to address them. On the other hand, there's also some possibilities or some opportunities there, because they are very influential companies, and making change within those companies have great effects. So engaging with them and including them in NCP processes will be extremely important, but maybe sometimes a little bit difficult because they tend to not belong especially anywhere. So, but it's an important issue. And that links or has a relationship to my final comment, which is a concern that Christina also mentioned initially, which is one of the main concerns when it comes to the NCP system, and that is that the NCPs differ in their setup and in their functioning, and not at least in their capacity throughout the NCP family. So more equivalence throughout the NCP family, not necessarily how they set up. There are flexibility in the way governments choose to set up their NCPs, and that may be okay, taking into consideration local issues, but they should work they should be properly financed and funded, and have the possibility to work and fulfill the mandates throughout. And that is not always the case. and the development towards more equivalence throughout the NCP family would be what I certainly wish for in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frode. Well, there are many very interesting questions coming in. I see here one from Kelly Dennis from CISA asking if there's a booklet of mediation cases that could be downloaded. I invite you to go to our website, and we have a database there with all the cases handled by NCPs. They're all publicly available. So I encourage everyone interested in the NCP system to go and check out our database and look at the cases. And of course, this report that we're presenting today presents also a number of very interesting cases. So if you want to learn more about that, please read the report. And yeah, check out our webpage. There's a lot of information there. I have also many interesting questions that I could ask Blake. One here from Catherine, who's asking if it's time to move to a centralized system like an independent body, which would have powers of investigation and a proper budget that would be mutualized and hence have more value for money. What do you think about that kind of proposal? If you could answer in 1 minute and maybe take 1 more minute then for your closing remarks, and then unfortunately we'll have to close this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question on that. I actually think it's a good idea. We've thought about some of that as well. I think it would actually have been helpful in the COVID-19 case handling and management to have a centralized way of dealing with that crisis and some urgency on some of those cases. That would have been a very positive contribution. I'd like to just say, look, we look forward to the next 10 years at least of the NCP. You know, I think my colleague at the BIAC at Winand, we would embrace the opportunity to work with you on making sure that we can improve participation. You know, the 2.5 million workers I cited, there were 21 million that did participate. So that is a sign. That's a sign that the dialogue hasn't occurred, and most of the cases lately have not resulted in dialogue. They've not gone forward with dialogue, and I think that's something we have to address. Chair Kaufman, I think, laid out a very clear: verify outcomes, enhance follow-up. Those two possibilities are the ways I think that we can, between unions and business, come together on a better footing to make the NCP go forward in a better way.
Well, thank you very much, Blake. We have very interesting questions coming in. Unfortunately, we cannot address them, but I think from the center, we'll try and write back to some of the people asking these questions. And some of them are more forward-looking, so maybe you will get your response in the second part of this event. So, and with this, I will close this panel. Thank you very much to all the speakers for your very rich and insightful contributions. And with this, I hand over to Nicola. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you all for these very interesting perspectives. I think we learned a lot about how the contribution of NCPs to remedy works in practice from the perspective of NCPs themselves, but also from the perspective of the user. That's very valuable. Moving on, I'm now very happy to welcome Professor Roel Nieuwenkamp, who was the first chair of the OECD Working Party for Responsible Business Conduct from its creation in 2013 until 2018. And who is now the ambassador of the Netherlands to Argentina. So Roel, the floor is yours for some thoughts on your experience and vision of the NCP system.
My video needs to be activated by the host, it says.
We will activate it, but please proceed with your remarks. We will activate your video now.
Yeah, there I am. Yeah, very good. Well, it's great to be back, and I see a lot of friends on the Zoom screen. So warm regards to all of you, and it's great to participate in this celebration. I have only a couple of minutes, so and there's a lot of time to catch. I've spent almost 10 years presiding over the responsible business conduct work of the OECD, starting with the revision of the guidelines in 2009 to 2011. And that was really a major effort, a major multi-stakeholder effort, global effort. And I lost all my hair during this revision. And in fact, it was a revolution. And it's good to remind ourselves, and I think Christine has done it too, that there are in fact two instruments. And one is the Council decision on the national contact point. That is a legally binding instrument. It's legally binding for governments. It's an international treaty. So there is already a business and human rights treaty. There is already a business and environment treaty. And the second instrument is the OECD guidelines for multinationals. That's not legally binding, but many commentators have said, including myself, it's morally binding. So these two elements are part of the work we're talking about. And the 2011 revolution in responsible business, so to say, covered many areas, but I will highlight three of them. First of all, there was a big hole in the guidelines at that time. There was no human rights in the guidelines. And thanks to the great cooperation with John Ruggie and his team, we could include human rights as a full-fledged chapter in the guidelines. But maybe even more important, and also for the NCPs, which was very important, is that we opened up the OECD guidelines and the NCP system for global supply chains. Because before 2011, we could only deal with foreign direct investment, which is a much smaller part of the global economy. But now we cover the whole global economy. And that makes it possible to, for example, now finally being able to deal with child labor in supply chains. We couldn't do that before 2011. So we could not have dealt with Bangladesh strategy on Rana Plaza before 2011, and the NCPs can do it now. Before 2011, we could not deal with financial sector cases because there were very often no foreign direct investments. Now we can. So there was a major revolution in this field. And the third point is, of course, that there were many improvements in the NCP system, peer reviews, the rules were sharpened. And for example, we included that there needs to be sufficient, adequate resources to the NCP. And well, when I left in 2018, I concluded that the glass was half full, because there were now many human rights related cases. I think at that time it was about 50%. So it really was built as a human rights remedy system. The performance was improved dramatically. The structure was improved. And in fact, it showed itself that you could have very strong and low threshold problem solving. And of course, the structure was still debatable, because there's many different models that could work, like multi-agency ones, independent NCPs, professional mediation, multi-stakeholder systems. And basically, they all proved to work. But there's only one system that I concluded when I left that should be ruled out, and that's the mono-agency, so single department, NCP without any stakeholder engagement. That system simply doesn't work. I hope they don't exist anymore. In 2018, we concluded that there have been many iconic cases. Frode already mentioned a couple of them, like the WWF case on the gorilla park in Congo. We had the Heineken case. We had the FIFA case in Switzerland. So there were many iconic success stories, which also helped the story of the NCPs. But as I concluded, it was half full, the glass, because there were still many NCPs that really didn't exist, or that they didn't perform well, or they had no resources, or they were not impartial. And these are all part of the binding treaty on corporate responsibility, that is the OECD guidelines. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Another point which I would like to stress, which is related to the NCPs, but also very strongly related to the 2011 revision, is the due diligence guidance. Because the due diligence guidance the OECD has made in a multi-stakeholder and a global fashion they're extremely important on the financial sector, on gold, on conflict minerals, on agriculture. And these guidances are now even more relevant now. For example, Germany, France, the EU, Switzerland, they're all working on making due diligence more mandatory. So these guidances are extremely important for this world right now. Well, one of the things that I've said when I left is use plain language. Because in fact, the OECD guideline, the OECD M&A guidelines, nobody has any clue what it means. Most people, especially here in Latin America, they have no clue what the OECD is. That's the first problem. Then what is the M&A guidelines? About what? So be clear, this is an OECD agreement on corporate responsibility. And the NCP is something similar. It's a ridiculous name. We've been making many jokes about it. This is a responsible business authority. It walks like a responsible business authority. It talks like a responsible business authority. Let's call it responsible business authority, because NCP, it doesn't make any sense. It's the worst name, worst framing ever. So I hope the next meeting of the NCPs will be reframed. Well, then the future, I've written a couple of so-called legacy blogs when I left, and I read them yesterday. It's quite, I think it's still quite relevant. One of the points that I made is measure the awareness. So measure the effects of your promotional work. And many NCPs are now doing so, which is, I think, great. But of course, this also should be done by all the others as well. Peer reviews. It's still voluntary. We made big progress, but obviously peer reviews in the OECD on a legally binding instrument should be mandatory. I cannot be too outspoken about it. And of course, policy coherence is a major issue, because which minister wants to go on a mission, on a trade mission, with a company that ignores the OECD guidelines or does not want to be involved in an NCP case? Which minister wants to grant export credit guarantees? Which minister wants to give public procurement contracts to companies that are not complying with the OECD guidelines? It's simple coherence, and it needs to be done. And then, of course, there's in the future, and I don't know when this will happen, but of course, there's still a couple of holes in the guidelines. For example, animal welfare, indigenous people rights, climate change is still quite weakly defined in the guidelines. And I think one of the points that are now very relevant is the internet firms. So do you really want to be involved in facilitating the spreading of fake news? Do you really want to be involved as a company to help spreading harmful content? This is something that the OECD should tackle in the future as well. So, well, just to conclude, I think still after 2 years after I've left, the glass is not half full again. It's a bit more full than it was 2 years ago, which is great. And still, I think, to the governments around the table, invest more in your NCP to make it a real responsible business authority. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Roel, for these very inspiring remarks and for pointing to the important developments that have taken place in the last years in NCP world, and in particular, the big leap forward in their coverage with the inclusion of human rights and due diligence in the guidelines, and also for showing the path to progress that NCPs are on, trying to fill that glass even more. Now it is time to go to the last panel entitled NCPs of the Future, What Next? Moderated by Mathilde Ménard, the Deputy Director of the OECD Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs. So may I invite Mathilde and her panelists to turn their cameras on and to take the floor?
Thank you, Nicolas. It's my great pleasure to moderate this second panel, and good afternoon to all of you. this panel will take a forward-looking view on the future of the NCPs, even though a lot of the panelists in the previous panel already did so, as well as the two chairs. And just to put that into perspective, you know that today we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the OECD, not only the 20th anniversary of the guidelines and the NCPs, sorry. So I think, and if you look at the brochure that has been made for the 60th anniversary of the OECD, I mean, the work with the guidelines and the NCPs feature quite prominently as a big achievement of the OECD. So that's a pleasure to highlight that. And I encourage you to go and watch this video. So this second session will build on the challenge and the strengths of the NCPs over the past 2 decades. And as they are highlighted in our report, the report that Christina summarized at the beginning of her panel, and also it was discussed in the previous panel as well by the two chairs. So the objective of this session is really to pinpoint possible actions that governments could take to enhance the impact and the effectiveness of NCPs at 2 levels. First, at the level of the individual NCPs, of course, such as it has been already repeatedly mentioned and highlighted, such as increasing the resources, human resources and financial resources that are allocated to NCPs, and also ensuring that these NCPs are fit for purpose. And the second area of action or level of actions, it's really to reinforce the NCP network itself. For example, by improving coordination, it was mentioned, coordination of practices, of procedures, and also by increasing or strengthening the monitoring of NCP effectiveness. So I hope that in this session, we'll be able to engage different perspectives on how to strengthen NCPs so that they are able to tackle the increased complexities of the global business environment, and particularly now, because we are now in December 2021, in light of the ongoing crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. So we have a great panel to do so. I'm very happy to meet with all of you. And I will begin by Manfred Shekulin, the chair of the investment committee. And as it was highlighted by Roel, the guidelines are in fact an annex to the OECD Declaration on International Investment and Multinational Enterprises. And therefore the working party is a subsidiary body to the investment committee. The declaration seeks to encourage the positive contribution multinational enterprises can make to economic and social progress. So Manfred, please, if you could first put your camera on. I don't see you myself. Here you are, sorry. And could you say a few words about how the global business environment has changed over the past 20 years, what to expect going forward, and how the NCP's role will have to evolve to contribute to a fairer globalization. Please, Manfred, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mathilde, for this kind introduction. Let me start by joining others in congratulating NCPs and everybody involved in the implementation of the guidelines on the significant achievements of the last 20 years that we're also celebrating here today. You already mentioned that the OECD is also celebrating its own 60th anniversary. And I may add, next year will also be the 45th anniversary of the Declaration on International Investment and Multinational Enterprises, of which the guidelines are part of. So there's quite a lot of history here involved. But I will take the title of the session quite literally and try a bold and optimistic glance into the future of NCPs. My starting point is, I think that's what you expect from the chairman of the investment committee, a world where significantly increased cross-border investment flows are a major pillar of the world successfully tackling the big global challenges we are facing, particularly, of course, the climate crisis. This in itself is already an optimistic approach. Latest OECD forecasts predict a 30% drop in FDI flows this year and FDI flows to developing countries are expected to decrease even more. And even before the pandemic, the picture wasn't rosy. Global FDI flows have been more or less on a sideways trajectory for the past 15 years. But we have no real choice. We know from studies that in order to achieving the transition to a low carbon, just and sustainable world, an additional 2.5 trillion US dollars of FDI inflows per year will be necessary in order to achieve the SDGs and to help developing countries to create and or upgrade the necessary green infrastructure. That creates three interconnected challenges. One, to mobilize the required funds. Two, to ensure that they are put to good use. And three, to mitigate adverse impacts of these increased flows. Creating the right regulatory environment necessary for the increased investment flows is, of course, the traditional focus of the OECD's work on investment. But the policy framework of investment is proof that the OECD's approach was never one-dimensional, but always holistic, balanced, and participatory, with a particular focus on the interaction between different policy areas and on the impact of FDI. In this context, I just want to mention one project, a recent project that I'm particularly proud of and that's particularly close to my heart in this context. That's the work on FDI quality indicators, where we exactly focus on the impact, positive and negative, of investment flows. And regarding the third aspect, the OECD is building on the groundbreaking work on responsible business conduct, and in particular on what I would call the holy trinity of RBC, the guidelines, the due diligence guidance, and the NCP system, better suited than any other international body to make a meaningful, positive contribution. That's a chance, but that's also a responsibility that we have to take seriously. And in this context, what I look forward to is a world where responsible business conduct and the respect of human rights are generally recognized as constituent parts of investment policy. And I see a global network of national contact points acting as highly visible and effective one-stop shops for all investment and supply chain related aspects of RBC, human rights and sustainability. That's my vision. The main ingredients are in place, but as Christine Kaufmann has pointed out, it won't happen on its own, but requires continuous efforts. The performance of NCPs, while having significantly increased, remains uneven and has to be further upgraded. And the same is, of course, the case for funding, which also has increased. I think it's difficult to understand that there was basically no money available for NCP work a few years ago. But so have, not only has the funding increased, but so have expectations. And therefore, securing the necessary funding remains a constant challenge. But, and that is the main point I want to make, most of all, the M&E guidelines and the NCP system need the willingness not to be content with what has been achieved, but rather to constantly strive to become better and redefine the state of the art. We must not forget that the procedural guidance for NCPs in the 2000 review that we are celebrating today was, at that time, highly contested. And so was, and Rule already referred to this in 2011, including a new chapter on human rights, fully in line with John Ruggie's groundbreaking work and the UN guiding principles. And even more so, at this time, novel concept of supply chain due diligence. And the not being content with low-hanging fruit that has been paramount to the guidelines' success so far has also to be our guide towards the future. This doesn't mean to throw everything overboard and start from scratch. On the contrary, it means building on what has been achieved wherever possible, but questioning the status quo without taboos wherever necessary. Rule has already given some ideas in what direction that might lead us. I'm not going to add additional ones at this particular stage. The stock taking, I'm coming to an end, that's currently going on in the Working Party is a good starting point for this. And I'm really looking forward to the results and the recommendations by the Working Party for the way forward. Hopefully in time for next year's ministerial meeting. Quality is, of course, an issue in this exercise, but if you allow me, I take this for granted. But so is timing, because, and with this I will end, as Laureen Bacall famously said, standing still is the fastest way of moving backwards in a rapidly changing world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manfred. Thank you for your call to questioning the status quo and not standing still. I can tell you that the whole team, the whole RBC team at the OECD is not definitely standing still, as well as the NCPs. So with that, thank you very much. I won't try to summarize what you said, Manfred. It's another keynote speech, I would say. Thank you for calling the whole thing the holy trinity of the guidelines, the due diligence guidance, and the NCP system. So let's go to the third, maybe I don't know which part of the trinity it is, the NCP system. And let me move to Maëlys Souk, who is the General Secretary of the French NCP. And Maëlys, you have been one of the longest serving NCP officials in the network. So you're kind of the mother of the network somehow. And could you comment on the evolution of the NCPs since you took office at the French one? And what do you see now as the main strengths and challenges for NCP? And as an NCP practitioner, how do you view the NCPs of the future and what it will take to maximize their contribution to remedy? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mathilde, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to participate today to the 20th anniversary of NCPs and speaking with
Maria, ne m'appelle pas, je suis en train de modérer une session, sinon...
Okay, so thank you, Mathilde, for the invitation and to speak with Roel. It's a pleasure to see him again. I would like to address some key words to respond to your questions first. The evolution. I will be brief. I will mention 3 words. The first one is serious. At the French NCP, and I am sure that other NCP too, we take our mandate very, very, very seriously for handling cases and also for the promotion mandate of NCPs, and I will be back on that topic. The second word for evolution since 2012, it's NCP network that was mentioned several times. It is a very important evolution. And the third word is peer learning that has also improved a lot in recent years. The strengths of NCPs, I will mention a few of them. The first one is visibility. NCPs are more visible than ever, and it is very important. They have more expertise than a few years ago, thanks to the work done by the OECD and multi-stakeholders, approaches to develop and adopt guidances about agricultural supply chain, government supply chain, due diligence, the mineral sector. So it helps NCPs to have more expertise on the topics. Another trend is that NCPs are key to support the uptake of due diligence in their country and also by companies when they are handling cases. And a very strong trend, if I can say, it's of course the revision of the guidelines 2011 that are still fit for purpose. They address due diligence, they address decent work, environment, human rights, many, many issues that we need to tackle as NCP. And so in a nutshell, I could say that NCPs even though we call them RBC agency, they are really a good tool to foster changes at government and at corporate level. The new challenges. I think that NCPs, we are facing new challenging, but also and sadly ongoing challenges. Of course, we all have COVID in mind and the economic crisis that we are now facing. We also have digital economy challenges, but we have ongoing challenges, tax issues, decent work, human rights, policy coherence. So all of this is there, it is on our plate, and it will stay on our agenda. I think an important challenge for NCPs in the coming months and the coming years, it will be policy coherence as we see more and more countries or regional organizations going to mandatory due diligence and bringing CSR at very high level of board of companies. And these are changes that NCPs can help to achieve through their role as driver for changes, again, at corporate level and at governmental level. And the last new challenge I would like to mention is the complementarity between NCPs and court cases. We know that this complementarity is improving. It is also raising important issues to NCPs, but depending the objectives and the aim of a complainant strategy, there is still an interest in addressing judicial routes and also non-judicial grievance mechanism. So I really think that there is a challenge to increase the complementarity among all the avenues to seek for remedy for victims. Now you ask me about NCP in the future and what could help us to maximize the contribution to remedy. I have 6 points there. The first one is that NCPs will remain a unique non-judicial state-based mechanism. It's there, it will remain there, even if we change the name to make it more easy to understand. The second point is that NCP need to keep on working on substantive issues to deliver substantive decisions. We know that NCPs are tools for dialogue to help the parties to reach an agreement, but in many, many cases, an agreement doesn't come at the end of the good offices. So there, we need substantive work to have substantive decision. We should not be shy to assess compliance with the guidelines. Assessing compliance is also explaining what should have been done or what should be done to have a more responsible business conduct. The third point, which I have already heard several times in the meeting today, it's the call on government to provide NCPs with adequate human rights, human resources, and communication tools. We also need the support of government to create fair conditions for autonomy of NCPs like we have in France. The fourth point is that in the EU in particular, NCP will have the challenge to follow and participate to the setting up of the mandatory due diligence regulation and the mechanism that will be embedded in the regulation to follow it up. And I think that at a global level, NCPs, we should engage with the ILO focal points to work together for responsible business conduct. And I was very happy to give a training last week to Western Africa focal points to work together on due diligence. The fifth point is the support of the OECD Center, of course, to improve NCP coordination, to help NCPs to better communicate on their decision and on their cases. And finally, I think that what will remain and what is a real challenge for us to maximize the contribution to remedy is to continue building trust for dialogue as a tool to achieve positive outcomes for the parties and for the companies as well as for the complainant. And with this, I give the floor back to you, Mathilde. Thank you.
Thank you, Maëlys. You highlighted a number of topics that were already highlighted, but you put some emphasis on new ones that I think are very interesting and important. In particular, like you You underline the importance of policy coherence, and as you said, that's a topic that we are working on. We are developing a lot of very interesting reflection on that, and potentially an instrument now it has been agreed. So I think it's a very important point. And you highlighted also this issue of complementarity with judicial mechanisms or court cases. So we'll probably work more on that in the future. Of course, the issue of resource, of autonomy, etc. And if I may repeat what you said, and also support for the RBC Center. So thank you very much, ladies. We are running late. I would urge all of you to stay tuned so that we have still like 10 minutes to listen to our last two speakers. First, Joseph Wilde from OECD Watch. OECD Watch is representing civil society for the ME guidelines. And as it was, I think, highlighted by Christine at the beginning, NGOs are the main submitters of cases before NCPs. And OECD Watch has frequently provided assistance in these cases. So it has also frequently made policy proposals to improve the NCP system as a whole. So we're very happy to have you here. And what would be your priority, OECD Watch, for actions by governments to improve the way the NCP system works and contribute to remedy? Please, you have the floor, Joseph.
Thanks so much, Mathilde, and thanks to the OECD and to everyone for the opportunity to speak today. Indeed, I think a few years ago, Roel, when he was still chair of the Working Party, he referred to OECD Watch as in business terms, as the preferred supplier or at least the primary supplier of cases and of case work to the NCPs on a whole range of different topics. Indeed, we have built a lot of experience over the past, I've been with OECD Watch now for 16, 17 years, so almost the full 20 years of the NCP system. That's about when OECD Watch was set up in 2003, so a lot of experience built up here. And indeed, a few years ago, I think back when we were celebrating a different anniversary, the 40-year anniversary of the OECD guidelines, I believe it was a few years ago, we brought out a 4x10 policy briefing for governments, 4 reasons why the OECD guidelines have a huge potential to play in ensuring responsible business conduct, and 10 recommendations and suggestions to governments for how to make sure that the guidelines are effective in that aim. And of course, many of those were related to the NCP structure. And today, on the 20th anniversary, I want to just speak very briefly to a few points from a new initiative that we are launching. It's the NCP evaluations, a set of criteria and index in which we are trying to measure how NCPs are performing, because I think as several of the speakers before me have noticed, the role of functional equivalence within the NCP system. And whereas we have, of course, a system whereby NCPs can be set up, governments can set up their NCPs to function best in their national context, it's of course important for the system as a whole to be predictable across all NCPs and to be effective across all NCPs. And so trying to gather information about where NCPs are indeed functioning in a way that is equivalent to other NCPs at a high level, sort of raising the level, raising the boat of all NCPs, and where gaps exist in terms of performance of NCPs and what needs to be worked on, I think is looking forward and where we need to go. So just to point out a few things, and again, sort of why I am obviously critical from our perspective as OECD Watch. I think that the glass, fine if you want to look at it as the optimistic perspective rule of looking at what's full. I would not say that it's half full, quite a bit less than that, but we can think of the perspective going forward. Only 3/4 of NCPs are still located in economics ministries and trade ministries, which has really raised severe concerns by civil society about the impartiality, at least perceived conflict of interest. Governments are really not doing enough to show that they are taking the NCP's work seriously. Just 5 NCPs have an independent structure, the one that OECD Watch has showed to be the most effective in achieving those outcomes, the outcomes that some NCPs have mentioned here, but really we can count those successes on a handful of NCPs. Just 5 governments attach consequences to the work of NCPs, to companies who refuse to engage in NCP processes, and to companies who are not abiding by the OECD guidelines. So I think it's really time for governments to show that they are taking the work of NCPs more seriously. Only a third of NCPs consistently follow up on the outcomes of their complaints. It's hard to see how you're really taking something very seriously if 2/3 of the mechanisms are not actually following up to see if anything is actually done with the outcomes of their NCP statements. And only with regard to communications, I think Maëlys and others have talked about this. There's a lot of room for improvement here. Only half of NCPs publish their final assessments, which is their final statements, which is a requirement, a legal requirement in the OECD guidelines for NCPs, and just a quarter publish their initial assessments of complaints. These are things that are crucial for the legitimacy of the overall system. People need to see, NCPs need to get the word out that they exist, and if they're not publishing these initial and final statements, that's a big issue. But really, I've been doing this for a while, but I am still optimistic towards the future for the role of NCPs and the OECD guidelines for a couple of reasons I'll lay out. I think the first and foremost is the trend and the momentum around mandatory due diligence, and finally making some of the key operational provisions in the OECD guidelines, like due diligence for RBC, mandatory. And I think that this gives me optimism for the NCP system, because I think it will have a positive spillover effect onto the NCPs by allowing cases that are better handled by judges and better handled by regulators with consequences and with teeth to handle those certain cases, and that will free up the NCP system to handle the cases that it is designed or that is appropriate to deal with. So I would really make a call out to all of the NCPs, all of the supporters, all of the friends of NCPs to really get on the boat and start lobbying and start pushing governments, your governments, to make due diligence mandatory, and that is going to have a positive benefit for the NCPs. The stock taking that Manfred and others have mentioned, I think is an important opportunity now. When we think about the stock taking, we can think about some of the thematic areas like climate change and tech that need to be improved, but really the core provision, the core section of the OECD guidelines that really needs the most improvement is the procedural guidance for NCPs. And in 2011, there were some changes, some sort of provisional and guidance and principles that were added, but really getting on the board with laying out clear and objective criteria for NCPs to be trying to work towards to achieve that functional equivalence is going to be necessary for the future. The stock taking should hopefully identify that, and we can move forward with an improvement of that, or a revision of that part of the OECD guidelines going forward. Really, this NCP evaluations project that we're launching today is aiming to do that, to provide that sort of objective information. And finally, again, sort of in line with making due diligence mandatory, the NCPs will be allowed to do that which they do best, and that is really get out there and some of the avant-garde, dealing with some of the avant-garde issues related to responsible business conduct, places where hard judicial mechanisms are not quite able to achieve yet, or that are really developing. You see NCPs are picking up on some of these issues because complaints come in from unions and from NGOs, things on like climate change and gender, where RBC in itself is still developing, and taxation, RBC, sort of the binding mechanisms, once they're hopefully there, may be a bit slower to develop into some of those new areas, and that will allow the NCPs to really get out there and play a positive role for RBC in picking up some of those fine areas of new developments. Thank you very much, Mathilde.
Thank you, Joseph. And now we are going to our last speaker, who represents the UN system, because Surya Deva is a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So Surya, could you, tell us, comment on how the NCP system fits within the broader remedy landscape, And what do you think the coming years hold for these mechanisms in general? And what do you think what are the types of remedy challenges that the NCPs will face in the future, and what they should do and to really prepare for the future? So yeah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Matilda. And let me also start by congratulating OECD, Responsible Business, and all the stakeholders for this wonderful milestone of 20 years. This is definitely an important opportunity to look what we have achieved and where we should be going in the next 1 decade or 2 decades. I think NCPs have played a key role in the last 20 years, and I think there are 2 critical reasons for it. One is that if we look at the comparable instruments like UN Guiding Principles or the ILO MNE Declaration, they do not have any comparable non-judicial system to accept complaints. And I think that means that because these 3 international instruments are aligned, that means that the NCPs are the primary non-judicial mechanism when it comes to these 3 international instruments. The second reason, in my view, is that there are significant barriers to accessing remedies through the court system. These barriers have been there for many decades. And I don't think we have made much progress in overcoming those barriers yet. Though we know how to overcome those barriers, but we have not made much progress in my view. And my sense is that going forward in the next 10 years, we may not be able to achieve much progress either. Perhaps I may sound very pessimistic, but my sense is that we have not made much progress, and we may not make much progress in terms of judicial remedies in the next 10 years. And if that is the case, then NCPs are likely to remain very central going forward, in my view, in access to remedy. But what are the challenges they're likely to face? I think the report, as well as several speakers, highlighted many of the challenges. Some of the challenges that are there, they're likely to continue. But let me pick up on 4 challenges, and then I will highlight 4 elements in terms of the way forward. The first, a key concern from my perspective is uneven quality of the NCPs, whether this is about the resources that they have, the independence they enjoy, and that triggers what I would call forum shopping. Because then the victims are weighing their options, which NCP is a better one, where they have more chances. And I think that plays into a highly problematic system of where there is no level playing field for the victims that triggers in the issue of discrimination. So a victim in a particular setting is disadvantaged simply because the NCP, which should be the natural NCP to file a complaint, is not good enough. So what is the fault of that victim? It's not the fault of the victim that the NCP is not strong. I think Royal highlighted that there are these single agency NCPs. Hopefully they're not there. But this report highlights they are still the majority. Look at the page 12. Page 12 is a shocker in my view, because most of the NCPs on page 12 of this report are still a single agency. And that is highly problematic. That must change. The second element is that I think NCPs have to evolve to the next stage, where they have to see themselves as someone who will provide actual remedies. They're not merely offices to facilitate a dialogue, of course, but dialogue should result in some substantive, effective outcomes. It's not merely about the process that is effective. And I think that is where the effectiveness of the remedy has to be judged in relation to what is the outcome they have delivered for the victims. In my view, in majority of cases, still NCPs are failing on this task. Yes, they have reached some agreements, and this report outlines those cases, but whether those agreements equals to effective remedy, that is a separate question. And I think rather than putting this question under the carpet, we should be confronting this question going forward. My third point is that often NCPs are at the mercy of businesses in terms of whether to collaborate, whether to engage or not, whether to implement the recommendations, right? This is highly problematic. I think this is something which must be improved. And here the leverage on the part of the governments is absolutely crucial to ensure that the businesses have no option not to engage. What they come out of the engagement process is a separate matter. But the option not to engage must not be there for any business. And I think that has to be definitely changed. My fourth challenge is the footprint of NCPs in non-OECD countries. If we look at the data, most of the complaints now are coming from non-OECD countries. But are they present in, so how are the NCPs seen and visible in the non-OECD countries? I think that mindset has to change. So if the complaints NCPs are receiving are from the global south, which are not part of these 49 countries, then you have to be visible there. How can you use technology to increase your footprint, right? In terms of visibility, in terms of access, I think those are the issues that needs to be dealt with. And the related issue here is about imbalance of power, which is a significant barrier is still, of course, you don't have to pay any fees to file a complaint, but there are significant barriers in terms of awareness, language, collection of evidence, how to do it, you know. So I think those imbalances have to be fixed in. As a way forward, my first suggestion is, and the working group is also doing a project on the next 1 decade, and I think I understand OECD is doing something similar. First is that the human rights are not optional. They are not optional for the governments. They're not optional for businesses. I think this is a core point. And if they are not optional, the governments have to create NCPs which are able to deliver effective remedial outcomes. Otherwise, we are just talking about it and we are not making enough progress. That is my first point. The second point is that we should not see NCPs as a compartment. I think one of the speakers highlighted, oh, we should not equate it with judicial system litigation. I agree. It is not a litigation system, but there has to be a synergy. For instance, if NCPs do not have the power of investigation, but certain national human rights institutions have power of investigation, so they can investigate. So NCPs can approach national human rights institutions to investigate and submit a report. That could form the basis of reaching this mediation settlement between the parties, right? If NCPs find that this case must go to a court, they should be able to refer it. If there is a case already pending, NCPs should be able to file an amicus brief and intervene in judicial litigation. So in my view, we should see a more dynamic relationship between NCPs and NCPs, of course, that is part of the recommendation as part of the network. But beyond NCPs, we have to look at other NHRIs, we have to look at the court system and all that. And my last point is we need to pay greater attention to substantive remedies. It's not merely about effectiveness in terms of the process. That is crucial. But what are the effective remedies? I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Surya. You added a couple of very important points. I'm afraid we are really very, very late. So it has been a fascinating discussion. We won't be able to have a Q&A session for this session, sorry. And I will just try to summarize in very shortly before we end up this discussion. So I think we got very clear message. First, to rename, that's somehow easy. Second, to resource. So the NCP system, I mean, each NCP, but also the RBC Center. Third, to be coherent. So that's something we are working on currently, as I mentioned. Fourth, to work on quality. And for that, we had a lot of indication of which are the areas we should work on to improve the quality of the overall system. And as Manfred Shekulin mentioned, not stay still. So that's, we have a lot of a big program of work. We are, engaging on the stock taking of the guidelines, and that will be also the occasion to highlight some of the key issues we need to work on. And it was clearly mentioned that we should work on the procedural guidance. We should look inter alia on how to make more systematically assessments of compliance with the guidelines. We should look at the conflicts of interest, be them real conflict or perceived conflicts of interest in the NCP structures. We should look at follow-ups, having more systematic and stronger follow-ups. We should look at some threats to complainants. Also, we should look at complementarity and how to have this synergy with the more like court cases, the whole system of remedies. And then we should look at substantive remedy. So we have a lot to do. And last but not least, we should work on the visibility on the NCP system, especially in the South, so that have a more globally visible system. So there is a lot to do. As Raul mentioned, when he left, he saw that the glass was half empty, half full. We are somewhere there. So we still have a lot to do. We have achieved a lot in 20 years. We have still a lot to do. So we'd like to thank all the great panelists for this session. I wish we could stay one more hour to discuss with the audience. There is definitely a high appetite for discussing the NCP system. And so thank you again. And I will give the floor back to Nicolas.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thank you again to all speakers and participants. Apologies for keeping you a bit longer than planned, but there was a lot to say about the remarkable contribution of NCPs to remedy for corporate impacts, but also the challenges they face and the support they need from governments. I really encourage all of you to visit our dedicated webpage on the 20 years of NCPs and to download the report to learn more. And to conclude, I would really like to take some time to thank all the NCPs. Of course, it's really great to work with you, and also thank all the colleagues who contributed to this report, and in particular, Christina Tebales for her leadership, Carissa Monroe, Luana Nilsson, Johnny Leruste, Juliette Lawal, Roxana Glavanov, Pauline Alexandrov, Barbara Bielich, Frauke Bulle, and Catherine Dovey, and all the colleagues in the RBC Center for the constant support. And with that, thank you again for your participation. Happy holidays already, and please stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.